Hi, I'm Nick Shell, and I am a YouTuber. And to be a relevant YouTuber, to have a growing channel that I have, I must become one with the comment section of my videos. I must know my audience. I know that a lot of my viewers are American, and they're trying to better understand American culture better. We can learn by me talking about such things. But a lot of my viewers are international, particularly European, and more specifically, Spanish, from Spain, the nation of Spain. Not necessarily Latino, but from Spain. So the perception is that I am ethnocentric. That's the perception, because I have zero interest in visiting Europe and I have zero interest in visiting Spain. So therefore that makes me ethnocentric, not the people saying that about me, which I think is ironic, but it has inspired this series that I want to embark on, which is I want to make a video for every foreign country I've been to and sort of self-assess the ethnocentrism involved in me going to that country. So let me start by going back into the past, 30 years ago, to the summer of 1988. First time I traveled outside of the country. My mom is from Buffalo, New York, which is not that far from the Canadian border. That's where she was born and raised until she was a teenager and moved to Alabama. And so as a 7-year-old, 30 years ago, we drove all the way from northern Alabama to Buffalo, New York, and we did get to go to Canada and see Niagara Falls. So it's interesting, because is Canada really that much different than the United States? Well, if you ask a Canadian, they tell you all the many ways that the United States and Canada are different. And I'll admit this is ethnocentric of Americans to think, but so many Americans in the United States, when we think of Canada, we think of them as the 51st state. Because they're so much like us. I mean, the accent, for the most part, you can't really distinguish that much. I mean, you can distinguish an accent from, let's say, Boston, Massachusetts, compare that to Houston, Texas. You could hear the difference there. But is that any different? Is it that much different than the different in accent that you would hear from someone, let's say, in Alberta, Canada, compared to someone in Wyoming, in the United States? Would there be that much of a difference? I think culturally, we're so much like Canadians. Our values are largely the same. We're not that much different. And some would say, well, Canada is more like England. Maybe so, but being such close neighbors. And it's funny because, to put it in perspective, Canada dips down into the continental United States. So there's parts of Canada that are actually more southern than a lot of the United States is. That's interesting to me. So for that to be my first foreign country to visit is really no surprise, despite I actually having ancestors back in Mexico. But 30 years ago, 1988, that summer, I went to a foreign country for the first time. And it's funny because as an American, it's funny to say that. It's really funny to say, yeah, I went to a foreign country. Where'd you go? Canada. And then the response you get is, pff. Because, and I guess too, as I do this series, as I pick apart the places I've been to that are different countries, again, that's the focus I want to look at. What part of that is ethnocentric? Well, and part of the irony, or why it's funny, because Canada is that familiar to us as Americans. There's really nothing exotic about it. You know, they're nice. We get along with them great. They look like us. They talk like us. Their values are the same as us. It's really, there's no big surprise in that. But yet, if you're from most other countries in the world, Canada would be quite an extreme to even get to, because it's so isolated compared to the rest of the world. But if you live in America, then you're not that far. Now, granted, consider how far we drove as a family in that 1988 Bronco 2 to get to Canada. the distance we traveled from northern Alabama to the Canadian border was probably bigger than the distance of going through a couple different countries in Europe. So I'll admit, by me going to Canada as my first foreign country, not that big of a deal and not that impressive when you're already from the United States. So it really was not that big of a struggle, and it probably only reinforced the concept to me as a 7-year-old kid 30 years ago that, hey, if you're an American, you live in the United States, go to Canada, go to a different country and realize things really aren't that different when it really comes down to it compared to other countries, which as a young boy, I'm sure only reinforced that concept to me and reinforced my building source, my building identity as an ethnocentric American. But hey, that's just my perception of reality. What do you think? Comment section, you know what to do.